In this video, we are going to be talking about literary analysis. So to analyze something means to break it apart. We've heard about a curious kid taking apart an old radio to see how it works. Analyzing literature uses more or less the same approach. Close reading is a term that we use for the style of analysis that most of us are taught in high school. It essentially entails putting literature under a magnifying glass to look very closely at the specific details and build an interpretation. It means asking, what do I see and what does it mean, over and over again to help build a layered interpretation. You might be familiar with the iceberg principle in writing. The idea is that any work of literature has many, many messages, and not all of them were necessarily intended by the author. We can see the messages that are on the surface above the water, but we can find messages below the surface as well. And as with an iceberg, most of the meaning is below the surface. When we apply close reading, we're delving below the surface level details to find the more profound themes, values, and beliefs. This can be a challenging process, but it can also make a piece of writing incredibly gratifying to read and analyze. To help prepare for discussions and analysis assignments, I recommend taking notes as you're reading. Questions you might want to consider asking yourself are, what specific passages stand out to you? Where do you see an important character detail? What specific wording by the author seems important to the story? What symbols jump out at you? What recurring themes pop up? What ultimate message do you see in the writing? This term, as we move through the readings, the instructional videos will typically end on a list of a few questions for the approaching literature. If you take notes along the way and test out some potential answers in the discussions, that should help build your analysis for the bigger assignments. We'll be doing the work of analysis in the discussions, of course, but at a couple different points in the term, you'll be asked to perform your own longer form literary analysis. Let's talk about some of that stuff that can apply for both cases. The structure and key components of an analysis. For the approach we're taking, there are three essential features that the analysis should contain: a guiding focus, textual evidence, and follow-up interpretations. For the guiding focus in the analysis, this is basically a thesis statement. What's the deeper insight you've uncovered? What's the take-home message? The goal for a literary analysis is to identify a message or insight that comes out of the literature and explains how that message or insight comes through. There are countless potential messages or insights within each literary work, so your job will be to narrow your focus down to just one. If you don't give yourself that guiding focus, then you're liable to just sort of jump around from general idea to general idea, staying more on the surface. The narrower and more definite your central point is, the deeper you can take your analysis. This is where it helps to zero in on a specific theme in a work of literature. And we're going to have a whole list about a dozen themes that we're going to explore throughout the term. They'll all fall under the umbrella of an approach to analysis called post-colonial theory. So we're already narrowing our topic as a bit as a group. Let's look at some made-up examples. Say you're analyzing the novel Blue Tomato by Sam Samerson. You've chosen to focus on the idea of civilized or uncivilized, which is one of our themes for the term. Here's an example of a focus that's not narrow enough. The idea of being labeled civilized or uncivilized is the theme of Sam Samerson's Blue Tomato. This is a weak choice for a guiding focus because it doesn't offer a clear insight. It just announces the theme, and we have no idea what messages the story contains about the theme. The analysis would probably just go in circles to try to find the point. It would probably present examples of people being labeled civilized or uncivilized in the story, but it wouldn't have a solid foundation for picking those examples apart. Now for something a little more effective. In Blue Tomato, Sam Samerson shows the consequences of being labeled uncivilized. So here we're definitely closer to a clear insight or message. This will be a slightly easier analysis to build, but how can we tighten up the focus? So for something more effective, we have in Blue Tomato, Sam Samerson shows how being labeled uncivilized separates people from power. With this last one, we have a specific insight that we're in a great position to develop with textual evidence and follow-up interpretations. When we bring in examples, we have that guiding focus for what to pick apart in those examples. That would also put us in a stronger position to connect the literature to the world around us. I hope you can see how the focus sets the parameters for the whole analysis and brings us advantages and disadvantages when it comes to developing the ideas. It's all about focus, focus, focus. The next element is textual evidence. At some point in school, you've probably heard this famous writing advice, show, don't tell. And I will probably say it a lot too. That applies to literary analysis, especially if you have it in Comp 1 or Comp 2. We can't just tell our audience about the things we've noticed in literature. We have to show the audience those things by offering textual evidence. That means providing relevant quotes and paraphrasing, and it can also mean providing a more general plot reference and paraphrases. I suggest doing a mixture of these two things. That's because too many direct quotes can overwhelm an analysis and crowd out our own ideas, and too many paraphrases of plot elements can keep us from demonstrating familiarity with the literature. And general plot references don't really give us much to work with for a close reading. I should add here that there's another form of support we can bring to an analysis, and that's relevant historical data. It's crucial to maintain an awareness of the historical and cultural context for a given work of literature, since that helps us access its layers of meaning. After all, when we're reading something from a different era and/or region, we could have substantially different worldviews and historical perspectives than the original audience. The only word of caution I'd mention here is that the analysis should ultimately be rooted in the literature itself. If we bring in historical data, that should be in the service of showing the reasoning behind how we're interpreting the story. This brings us to the third element. Textual evidence should be followed up by clear interpretations. We don't want to just present a bunch of textual examples and leave it to the audience to connect the dots for us. The follow-up interpretations are how we make our reasoning accessible to other people. And that's really the meat of the analysis. The guiding focus helps rein in the ideas, and the textual evidence gives us the raw material to pick apart. But the follow-up interpretations are where the analysis will all come together. It's where we can really dig into the specifics of the evidence and tie back to a deeper message we identified as our guiding focus. This is where we show how we got from point A to point B. While we're at it, I'm going to add a quick note about conclusions for literary analysis. This really depends a lot on what form the analysis takes, but if we're working with a structure where we have a specific concluding section, here's how to avoid the, okay, now how do we get out of here problem. We don't want to just repeat the main idea, since that can feel robotic and more like a placeholder than a definitive closing thought. Instead, we can consider the so what question. Why do the concepts we've covered actually matter? What relevance do they have beyond the pages of the story? If the greatest triumph for a piece of literature is to deepen our understanding of the world around us, then the greatest triumph for literary analysis would be to show how that happens. We can lean into this whenever we wrap up our analysis. And a quick note about style in a literary analysis too. Like with conclusions, the most effective style can also vary depending on the form the analysis takes. But in general, you want to maintain a somewhat objective, detached approach. A key way to do that is by avoiding first person. That means avoiding I statements. There's nothing inherently wrong with I wording, of course, and there are plenty of contexts where it works beautifully. I've used a bunch in this video even. But for literary analysis, avoiding I can show you're thinking beyond your own reading experience. It's a check on whether your interpretations go beyond your own individualized reading and can be logically supported through evidence. The other element of style to avoid is references to the analysis itself. This is something that tends to come through when people set up their guiding focus with wording like, this analysis will focus on, or in this analysis I will. The trouble is that people who use this approach often take much longer to get to the specific insight they're focusing on for their analysis. Take this sentence for instance. In this analysis, I will explore the theme of identity. The audience will still have no idea what the specific point is. What is the insight or message about identity? Be as clear and direct as possible when you establish your focus. Don't offer your personal response as a substitute for analysis. The audience doesn't need to know how boring you thought something was or what a page turner you thought it was. Those responses can certainly be connected to the style and themes and messages of the literature, but stick to the substance of the story for your analysis. Don't just point out examples. This is probably the most common error. If you're analyzing a theme requires going beyond pointing out examples. If you're analyzing the theme of oppression, you can start your planning by taking stock of examples. From there, pick apart the examples and look inside them to see what they're revealing about oppression. Then, in your analysis, the focus should be on your interpretations rather than on the examples themselves. If your analysis seems like a list of examples, then it's like you're sharing your planning instead of the finished analysis. Don't rely too much on the summary. Assume that the audience is familiar with the story itself. You could offer a small refresher here and there, but there's no need to include hundreds of words just to rehash the plot. At best, it's distracting and confusing for the audience when you get too far from the analysis and veer into summary. At worst, it can seem like padding meant to hide a relatively undeveloped analysis. And there you go. Here is your basic guide for a literary analysis. This information came from Miss Karen Kaiser, who helped build this course, and she built this presentation and graciously allowed me to rebuild it for this class.